International organizations play a crucial role in the development, implementation, and enforcement of international law. They are entities established by states or international treaties, designed to facilitate cooperation, promote peace, resolve disputes, and address global challenges through legal frameworks and agreements. These organizations are instrumental in shaping international law by creating treaties, conventions, and resolutions that guide the actions of states and individuals on the global stage. Here's a detailed look at international organizations and their relationship with international law. 1. Role of international organizations in international law. International organizations help to establish legal norms, rules, and standards that member states are expected to follow. Their role includes treaty-making. International organizations often draft, negotiate, and adopt international treaties and conventions, which become legally binding for member states. Dispute resolution. They provide mechanisms for resolving disputes between states, individuals, or other entities. For example, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, as the principal judicial body of the United Nations, UN, adjudicates disputes between states. Peace and security. Many international organizations, such as the UN Security Council, are responsible for maintaining international peace and security, addressing threats like conflicts, terrorism, and human rights abuses. Human rights protection. Organizations like the United Nations Human Rights Council, UNHRC, are tasked with promoting and protecting human rights through legal standards and mechanisms. Global governance. They help to regulate global challenges that cross borders, such as climate change, e.g., UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, or health crises, e.g., World Health Organization, WHO, using legal frameworks to coordinate international efforts. Monitoring and compliance. Many international organizations oversee compliance with international treaties and agreements, ensuring that states adhere to international legal obligations. Point 2. Major international organizations and their legal functions are United Nations, UN. The UN is the largest and most influential international organization, established to promote international peace, security, human rights, and development. It consists of several agencies and bodies that contribute to international law. UN General Assembly creates resolutions and frameworks but cannot enforce binding international law. UN Security Council has the authority to take binding actions in response to threats to international peace and security, such as sanctions or military intervention under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. International Court of Justice, ICJ, the primary judicial organ of the UN, settles disputes between states and gives advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it. Human Rights Council, UNHRC, works to protect human rights globally, through conventions and monitoring. B. World Trade Organization, WTO. The WTO regulates international trade and ensures that trade agreements and policies are in line with international law. Its functions include dispute settlement mechanism, resolves trade disputes between member states using binding rulings. Trade agreements, facilitates the negotiation and implementation of trade agreements, such as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, that shape international trade law. C. European Union, EU. The EU is a regional international organization with its own legal system, which has a significant impact on international law, especially in Europe. Key aspects of its role include EU law. The EU has its own body of law, which includes treaties, regulations, and directives that are binding on member states. International trade and diplomacy. The EU negotiates and implements international agreements on behalf of its member states, such as trade deals with other countries or regional organizations. Court of Justice of the European Union, CJEU, interprets EU law and ensures its consistent application across member states, resolving disputes that affect both EU and international legal obligations. D. International Monetary Fund, IMF. The IMF works to ensure the stability of the international monetary system and financial stability. Its role in international law includes financial regulations, oversees financial systems and economic policies to prevent economic crises. Loans and assistance, provides loans to member states facing financial difficulties, often in exchange for the adoption of specific economic policies. E. World Health Organization, WHO. The WHO is responsible for global public health, and its role in international law includes health regulations, promotes international public health law through frameworks like the International Health Regulations, IHR, which deal with the response to disease outbreaks and other health emergencies. Global Health Standards develops international legal norms and guidelines for health practices, promoting safe medical procedures, disease control, and access to medicines. International Labour Organization, ILO. The ILO develops international labor standards, ensuring fair working conditions worldwide. Its work in international law includes labor standards, establishes conventions and recommendations regarding labor rights, such as working hours, minimum wage, and child labor. Monitoring and reporting, assesses the implementation of these standards and encourages compliance by member states. Point 3. Key principles of international law influenced by international organizations. Sovereign equality of states. Under international law, all states are equal under the law, meaning they have equal rights and duties regardless of their size or power. International organizations like the UN emphasize this principle through their inclusive membership. Non-intervention. While international organizations seek to promote peace and security, international law also upholds the principle that states should not interfere in the internal affairs of other states, except in cases like human rights violations or breaches of international peace. International treaties and conventions. Many international organizations facilitate the creation of treaties and conventions that govern state behavior in areas like trade, human rights, environmental protection, and warfare, e.g., the Geneva Conventions on the Laws of War, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Responsibility to protect, R2P. This principle, endorsed by the UN, argues that the international community has a responsibility to intervene when a state fails to protect its own citizens from mass atrocities like genocide, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. Customary international law. Some practices and norms become binding over time through widespread and consistent state practice, even without specific treaties. Organizations like the UN and WTO help codify and formalize such customary laws. Point 4. Legal frameworks and treaties managed by international organizations. International humanitarian law, IHL, enforced by organizations like the UN and ICRC. IHL governs the conduct of armed conflicts and seeks to limit their effects, protecting civilians and those who are no longer participating in hostilities. Environmental law. Treaties like the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, managed by organizations such as the UNFCCC, are binding international legal frameworks for addressing environmental issues. International criminal law, ICL. The International Criminal Court, ICC, created by the Rome Statute, prosecutes individuals for international crimes, such as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Trade law. The WTO oversees the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, which are international trade treaties that govern how trade and intellectual property should be handled between nations. Point 5. Enforcement of international law. Unlike national laws, enforcement of international law often depends on the willingness of states to comply. However, international organizations help to ensure enforcement in various ways. Judicial bodies. The International Court of Justice, ICJ, the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, and the International Criminal Court, ICC, provide judicial mechanisms for resolving disputes and holding individuals or states accountable for violations of international law. Sanctions and diplomatic pressure. Organizations like the UN Security Council can impose sanctions, such as trade restrictions or asset freezes, on states that violate international law or fail to comply with UN resolutions. Peacekeeping and military action. In cases of conflict or security threats, international organizations, particularly the United Nations, can deploy peacekeepers or authorize military interventions to uphold international peace and security. Conclusion. International organizations are central to the development and enforcement of international law. They play a pivotal role in creating legal frameworks, fostering cooperation among states, resolving disputes, and addressing global challenges. Through treaties, conventions, and other legal mechanisms, these organizations help regulate everything from trade and human rights to security and environmental protection, ensuring that states adhere to established norms and principles in the international legal system.